Okay, welcome to the first torso and shoulder lecture for the figure sculpture course. Okay, so this is a jump straight into the deep end because we are really going to tackle some of the hardest stuff of the body this week, and we're going to continue with this next week. But we really have to get going because there is a lot to cover in all these subsequent weeks, so we got to start somewhere, and we might as well start with the hardest. So I need to give you guys a fairly comprehensive review of the anatomy going forward because this is, again, critical for how we approach the figure. You know, as we talk about construction, we really have to know what to construct, and when we know what to construct, it kind of coincides with what we need to try to observe from our reference. Okay, so let's just talk about the landmarks on the skeleton again, just to review everything, because we're going to go from here to some of the reference of the models for the course, and we're going to spin them around on the turntable and look at how all these landmarks interact with each other in 3 dimensions. And then we'll talk about the musculature on top of that as well. Okay, so let's just get started. So remember, what we have to look at when we're talking about landmarks is we have to look at the areas where the bone is more or less directly under the skin, right? And that's going to give us kind of hard points of the body where we can start to really kind of etch in some lines on our sculpture and build out from those. Okay, so we'll start with the rib cage, and this is kind of a landmark lecture, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about volumes as well, just because they're right in front of me. But the rib cage obviously is generally covered by muscle in most areas, except for what we have highlighted in red here. So we have the sternum, okay, down here, and we have a little keystone shape at the top, the manubrium. And remember, there's a little divide in the middle, which can create a bump, and it creates a nice little striation in the chest muscles going out. These are generally superficial. We have pectoral muscles grabbing on either side, but we'll look for kind of a hard median line going down. Okay, from there we look down at the break of the costal cartilage, right? So we have ribs out here, which is actual bone, and then you can see the break right here on the plate. This is where it turns the costal cartilage, and if you remember correctly, we have ribs 1 to 5 that grab directly on, and then 6 kind of goes and bends its way up, and then 7, 8, 9, and 10 all kind of converge in their costal cartilage and join each other, right? So we get this kind of fairly irregular convergence of the cartilage going up, and this creates what we'll call the costal arch down here. Okay, so costal arch is superficial, except for the fact that it has abdominal muscles going over it. So depending on whether the abdominal muscles are flexed or whether they're relaxed, more or less of this will be shown at the top. Likewise, when we talk about the muscles out here, we'll talk about external obliques that cover costal cartilage out here. Okay, and that's what I'm going to say about that for now. If we just have a quick look over here, we'll see this as we come to the exercises for this week, that you can actually see exposed the lower 4 ribs, depending on the articulation of the body, right? So if just change colors really quick. If we kind of block in some of the muscles that are in this area, right? We have some latissimus dorsi in here that's kind of thick along this edge, and we have spinal erectors going up here that are also thick right in the center. Up here, we don't worry about it. We have enough stuff to cover the ribs, but in this little window, depending on how the body is articulated, how thinly the latissimus dorsi are stretched, we get a little window into those bottom 4 ribs. So we keep our eyes out for those. Okay, so that's it for the ribs for right now. We'll see more in a minute. Now back down to kind of the core of the body, I guess, and what we're talking about is the pelvis, right? And so what we really need to be aware of is, and locate as one of our critical landmarks, is the anterior superior iliac spines, right? These are the forward points of what we'll call the iliac crest, which is kind of where the bone of the pelvis is exposed underneath the love handles, which are the external obliques, and above the gluteal muscles, right? So anterior superior iliac spine is going to be critical for us, and that's going to be one of the first things that we lay in when we start sketching our landmarks. Anterior superior iliac spine, we'll hash in a couple lines for the costal arch, put a center line there for the sternum, and that'll take us up to the clavicles, right? And the clavicles and the pit of the neck, what we can call pit of the neck, or the suprasternal notch, meaning above the sternum, and notch, suprasternal, brings us to the clavicles, right? And so clavicles, again, are critical because they're exposed on the top. We have chest muscle generally coming off the bottom, or kind of the anterior border of it. But the top is going to be a landmark that we etch in as well, right? So you can't see it or appreciate it in this view, but the clavicles, if I rotate this view and move it over, remember the nice subtle S shape that the clavicles have, right? So we're talking about something like this. And again, this kind of goes back to all the investigation of the skeleton that we did in the anatomy course for people who have been on it, because this is really important, and we'll see it in the reference, so we can catch up with that then. But this turned up like that gives us that, and then at the back edge, I'm actually looking down this guy's neck, right? So that's his neck. This is his rib cage here, and this is his arm going down. Right, so this is the clavicle coming out, nice and S-shaped, something that we're going to kind of etch in when we get into ZBrush. Comes out to this big square called the acromion process, right? And you can see it here. Joins the clavicle in a little fibrous junction. This leads us to the spine of the scapula going down. Right, again, superficial. So we find the point of the shoulder. We work really hard to get that little rectangle shape. Because we know that no muscles sit on top of the rectangle. It's just kind of a nice placid little square of bony landmark for us to sculpt around. And we know that all of the deltoid muscles come off of it, right? So around that, and then kind of above, we know that there's trapezius muscles. Okay, I'm just doing a really quick and dirty sketch in, I guess, top view of what hangs off of the acromion, right? And that brings us to here, right? So acromion goes down slightly obliquely, the spine of the scapula, to the medial border, right? We like to put this in. We make these two marks on our model. So we find the point of the shoulder, bring it in, grab those two, because this is going to be our scaffolding for all the muscles that come off in this direction, all the muscles that come off in this direction, all the muscles that come off in this direction, all the muscles that go up back here and up here, etc., etc. Okay, so we remember those. We'll talk about those in a minute. So remember, acromion process, spine of the scapula, medial border of the scapula. And then we have this guy, seventh cervical vertebra, is the most protruding vertebrae on the body, and he pops out right at the kind of the top of the thorax, right at the top of the rib cage, because the next thing that pops up is the first thoracic vertebra. Okay, so we'll follow all those down. That's fine. We're not going to worry about too much these. We'll see some of these in the reference, so we can talk about those, the 5 spinous processes of the lumbar vertebrae. So you'll see these in the depression, either side of the spinal erectors. Right, let me just change colors and put in some spinal erectors. I've done it once already. But we have a mass of muscle going either side here, which are going to be like tubes. And we'll look out for those. And the spineous processes just sit right at the base of that and create little dimples. Okay, so enough about those. Moving on. As we come back down to the pelvis, we're talking about the mirror of the anterior superior iliac spine, and that's the posterior superior iliac spines. Right, and those are going to create the little dimples on a woman. On a man, it's sometimes not a dimple, but just a little depression. And really, what we're going to do is we're going to put those in, and we're just going to kind of sketch in the iliac crest with this kind of gesture. And this is going to give us a place to orient our spinal erectors, like I've just done. It'll give us a place to bring our latissimus dorsi to, and generally just help us orient all the construction in the lower back. Okay, so between the front and the back, those are the critical things. Obviously, there's a lot of form to that, and we'll see how that comes together when we get to the reference. But now let's hang some muscle off of these landmarks. Okay, so here's the muscle plates. This is again Paul Richet's plates, same as the previous slide. Very good, very accurate slides, so we use them extensively, both in this course and the anatomy course. And so what I want to do quickly as we work through these is I'm just going to give you a quick sketch over of where the landmarks were that we just talked about, because a lot of this is covered by muscle now. We'll talk about those. Here's the anterior superior iliac spines, iliac crest going back. In the side view, just memorize this because we're going to see this again in a couple slides when we look at our Andrew, one of our models. Quite lean. Looks almost like this plate, actually. So anterior superior iliac spine, magic! Exclamation point. Iliac crest going back. Look at the gesture. Memorize that gesture. And back to the posterior superior iliac spines. Okay. Bit of lumbar vertebrae. Clavicle coming out, hitting the acromion process out here, the spine of the scapula going down. Right. Little rectangle of bone, spine of the scapula going down, medial border coming down here. All right, so you'll see when we get to the ZBrush session where I'm doing my working example of the sculpt, these are the kind of things that I hammer in. Right, I'm not delicate or precious about it. I will literally go in with my clay tubes brush and I will just kind of lay down these landmarks. And they look ridiculous at the start because they're just on like a tube with no contours and no shape. But the fact is that these become the scaffolding for building the rest of the form and moving this around to get it in the right place and then refining volumes and silhouettes. Okay, so those are the landmarks on the muscles. Okay, the muscles themselves, a big task to be sure. But because this should be review for most of you, we're going to go through it at a breakneck pace. Okay, so remember, pectoralis major, 3 distinct heads, right? 3 distinct sections. Clavicular section attaching to the middle third, to middle half of the clavicle. Sternal section coming down and across and inserting out here. And abdominal section down at the bottom, attaching to this kind of white stuff, which is the fascia of the external obliques. Okay, and this is going to go up here. Okay, so 3 distinct things, and you get the overlap, right? If you remember as I change colors, a lot of the form is created from this going top down, middle across, and bottom up, right? So we're going to get this little dimple in the corner. This whole thing is relieved on a raised arm. Remember, if we raise the arm up like this, those are inverting themselves. Okay, so we'll pay attention to the articulation of the shoulder and how all this stuff articulates, because this is going to be very important how this flows out to its insertion on the humerus, especially in the poses that we have for this week's fragments. Okay, so that's the 2-cent tour of the pectoralis major. From there, we'll move out along the clavicle, and notice we'll have this little section where we don't have any muscle, called it creates a little fossa, or a little depression below, and a little depression above as well. Infraclavicular fossa is what we'll call that, below the clavicle. Okay, and that brings us out to the deltoids, right? We have 3 heads of the deltoid: front, anterior head, the medial head, which is the middle head, and the posterior head, right? And all of these kind of converge starting at the end of the clavicle, so the outer quarter probably, and then for the anterior head, medial head goes across the acromion, right? So we have the square of the acromion sitting up here, and the medial head comes off the lateral border, and then the posterior head, which we're going to pick up in this view, is going to attach into the spine of the scapula via this little bit of tendon. Remember? Okay, so that's those 3 heads, and again, these are a nice little kind of convexity when the arm is down, and the acromion process contributes to the convexity. But when the arm raises, what you get is you get the acromion process still staying it becomes a depression actually. So it's no longer convex. All the muscles kind of billow out around it to the front and the sides. Okay. And biceps up here. I'll orient you with an elbow and an arm going off like this. Wrist. And thumb, fingers, blah, blah, blah. Okay, there we go. I've just kind of articulated this guy a little bit. Okay, so that's the deltoids, and we'll pay attention to those and how this changes when we start to look at our reference. Okay, moving along the spine of the scapula, we've talked about the rear deltoid below. We have to look at the trapezius above. Right, so we have trapezius coming off here, above the spine of the scapula, the inside of the acromion, and around on the clavicle as well. And remember, it creates this kind of substantial mass on the shoulder. Going back to this diamond-shaped triangle. And then it descends down in this little tail, down to the last thoracic vertebra down here. Okay, we see it quite prominently in back view. In the side view, we can see where it comes from, kind of mirrors the origin of the deltoid going up. And then we can see the section where it comes down the spine of the scapula. Okay, and in the anterior view, you're just getting that mass that's sitting on top of the shoulder. Okay, let's work down the scapula for this little review. And I'll change colors, and we'll go to blue. And so landmarks again, those 2 brings us to this point, bottom corner of the scapula, and it's going to give us this guy, the teres major. All right, so magic little muscle, goes up, helps to pull. It inserts into the humerus, helps to pull the arm towards the scapula, right? So one of our climbing muscles. that guy is really nice, and depending on what the arm is doing, he'll either pop out, or if he's relaxed, he won't necessarily create the same form, but we'll see him quite frequently. The associated climbing muscle that works in conjunction with the teres major is the latissimus dorsi, which is this big guy, and he crosses halfway over generally the teres major, and he's going to come down and he's going to insert into the high point of the iliac crest. His muscle fibers terminate at this big white tendinous aponeurosis in the lower back, so it's a big sheet of tendon that creates a big distributed origin for the muscle, and this goes up into the armpit. Right from the side view, if you cut away the arm, you get this nice shape coming down. Kind of a nice S shape on the anterior border of the latissimus dorsi. And then it fans back from there. That's all I'm going to say. On the back edge, it tucks under. Everything tucks under the tail of the trapezius. So this red diamond shape here is the highest layer, the most superficial layer of muscle on the upper back. Okay, I'm going to talk about these as they show up, right, as we walk through this, because I know exactly what's coming up on our reference. I suppose if you wanted to, you could flip forward and do a quick preview, but serratus anterior are going to play a big part in the exercises for this week. So we want to just have a quick look at how those interact and where they come from. Right, so we had that border, and serratus anterior grab onto the rib cage, remember? And they go all the way up to I think the second rib, and maybe even the first rib. But regardless, we don't see any of that because they're hidden up here under the pectoralis major and the front deltoid. When we start to see them is we start to see one peek out at the level of the chest, which is fifth rib here. And generally you won't see this when the arm is down, because the chest muscle descends and it sits over that with kind of skin folding. So that's kind of a mystery digit, and we'll keep our eye out for him because we can see him in this week's exercises. Okay, and then the big ones are this one on the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. Occasionally some people will have a little digit on the 9th, but some people don't. So you primarily see 3. Okay, and these interact with what we call the external obliques, which is our big twisting muscle of the side. Right, and they both grab onto the ribs, and the serratus anterior grab onto the body of the rib. The external oblique grab onto the underside. If I just step backwards, I can show you a little bit here what I mean. The serratus anterior are going to grab on like this, actually to the body of the rib, and then in a different color, the external obliques are going to grab onto the bottom edge of it, right? So that's how they interdigitate. Right, so body and edge. So just to keep that clear in your mind as we move forward. Okay, so that's how you get this zigzag and the classic comic book pattern, right? We've seen it a million times. The fish gills that they put on the side of the characters. We need to know a little bit more and be a little bit refined with our treatment of it, though. Okay, so this is where we see them, but where do they come from? Remember, this body of muscle actually comes back from the underside of the scapula, right? So it comes back off of this and creates this little continuation of volume coming down. Okay, and then it erupts from under the latissimus dorsi and exposes the digits right where they insert onto the rib cage. Actually, they're originating there and they're inserting onto the bottom of the scapula, to be correct about origins and insertions. Okay, so we'll see those. They feature quite prominently, and that leads us into the external obliques. So we talked about these upper digitations, And where do those go to, right? They come from the ribs, and they insert onto this big white tendinous sheet, which is called the aponeurosis of the external obliques. All right, so it's a big fibrous sheet that they grab onto and they pull against. All right, and we'll see these edges in our, and we'll have to sculpt these edges in our models this week. So this is all important stuff. I'm not going into undue detail here. This is all really important stuff. Okay, so look out for the edges of these where they grab onto the big fiber sheet, because it happens and it's there. And then as you work your way down, you get to this edge where it turns the corner, right? And I'm going to put a big red check mark there because we're going to keep our eye out for this big X, looking for that corner. Okay, and as that mass, we don't need any slideshow help. Thank you very much. We're very experienced. Okay, as we turn the corner, we're going from there back to the iliac crest. So we've just seen this. This is all out in this aponeurosis inserting. Comes back a little bit, and bam, it's back on the bone right here. Okay, and this is the big mass of love handle muscle that comes back and grabs onto the back ribs, right? So we're talking about 12, 11, and 10 from here. And then these guys are going up to 9 and 8 and so forth as it moves up, right? And this really is the twisting muscle, right? And it's important to know it's a twisting muscle because actually this week one of our guys is twisting at the waist, right? So this muscle is pulling the ribs forward this way. So the muscle shortens and it stops going diagonally back. It starts to go more up like this. Okay, that's what happens when the muscle articulates. Okay, so that gives us external obliques. That gives us latissimus dorsi. We have this. We have talked about teres major. We talked about the medial border of the scapula. We talked about the spine of the scapula. We talked about the trapezius coming down over top. Keep your eyes open for this diamond of tendon. And one thing that we haven't talked about is what we can barely see, but I know exists underneath all of these layers, and that is a muscle called the rhomboids. Right, so I'm just going to put that in, and I'll change colors to something like red. So the rhomboids come off of the medial border. We have stuff on this side, but what we need to talk about is this muscle that comes off obliquely this way to make a rhomboid, right? A rhomboid is a square, same sides, but just kind of skewed off like this. Geometrically, that's what a rhomboid is, and that's what it does here, right? And given that the trapezius at the bottom, this tail of the trapezius is very thin, it overlaps the rhomboids, and depending on the articulation of this area, the rhomboids can pop out or the trapezius can pop out. All right, so it's variable shapes. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about the spinal erectors. So sitting under all these layers, sitting under the lats, sitting under the trapezius, sitting under this aponeurosis, this tendinous sheet, we have two volumes of spinal erectors going up. The first volume is the central mass, which attached to the sacrum, which is this big bony plate at the back of the pelvis, and it goes up as a column of muscle, slowly thinning as it goes because its fibers are jumping off at each successive vertebrae. Right, so two columns. It's a little bit of a poor drawing, but we'll see this again in reference. Okay, that's the medial or the middle column of muscle. Lateral to that, we have a mass that sits right in here that attaches via tendon to this area, and it creates a nice round form that kind of highlights itself and ascends. And again, this is sitting under the latissimus dorsi. And latissimus dorsi is pretty thin in this area, so often this volume can be seen quite prominently. And we'll see this in a minute. Now, lastly, the piece of the puzzle that's missing here that I haven't spoken about is the rectus abdominis, and it kind of sits obviously in between the external obliques. Comes down to the pubic symphysis, which is the landmark right down here, the convergence of the pubic bones on either side, and it goes up to 5th and 6th ribs, so right underneath the chest muscle, actually. Okay, and what we have is generally, if we're talking about the average person, we're talking about 4-pack. You've heard me say this before. 4-pack with a big 40-ounce malt liquor at the bottom, right? So big square pack at the bottom. If somebody has a 6-pack, the 6-pack, remember, lives up here as 2 abbreviated muscles sitting above the costal arch or just on the margins of it and filling in, creating mass underneath the bottom edge of the pectoralis major. Okay, and a few kind of subtleties that we need to know about the rectus abdominis that we need to remember is there's generally a distinct asymmetry between sides. You can have a line of symmetry going down here to the navel. Generally stops there and doesn't continue down here. But either side, the kind of divisions in the muscular fibers take on a marked asymmetry. And also the lines, kind of the tendinous separations, are quite irregular as well. Right, so we can see some really unusual patterns emerge depending on the person. So just keep an eye out for all those things as we go forward looking at this stuff. So that is, again, the poor man's review of the anatomy of the torso in like 20 minutes. It's quite abbreviated, but I do hope that it's a review for all of you, because these are the things that need to be just kind of understood before we proceed with trying to sculpt it, because one without the other is almost impossible. Okay, so let's look at this on our reference now.